Hello, Marie-Therese from Fingal Libraries here again. And today, as it's International Women's Day, I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about some important female scientists. Now, in the past, it was very hard for women and girls to become involved in science, but some women did manage to make their mark on many different fields of science. The book I'm going to be using is called The Book of Big Science Ideas. It's written by Freya Hardy and illustrated by Sarah Mulvaney. Now, the first woman I'm going to talk about is a woman called Marie-Anne Lavoisier. Here she is. And she was involved in the field of chemistry. And she was involved in producing an early version of the periodic table. Now, this is the periodic table that we use today. And it's a special table in which the elements are arranged into groups with similar properties. Marie-Anne Lavoisier was married to a man called Antoine. They both came from noble families and were highly educated. In 1789, that's over 200 years ago, they wrote the first modern textbook on chemistry, and it contained a list of 33 simple substances, which today we call elements, and these included oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen. Now, they did make a few mistakes. For example, their list incorrectly included light and heat, but the talented duo did show that water wasn't an element, and 23 of the elements they listed are still recognized today in our present periodic table. Now, I'm going to move on to another lady called Marie Curie, and she worked in the field of chemistry and physics. And here she is. Marie Curie lived between 1867 and 1934, and she was Polish. She and her husband Pierre investigated radioactive elements. Now, this was dangerous research, but we didn't really understand that at the time, and Marie eventually died from radiation poisoning. But during her long career, she discovered two new elements on the periodic table: number 84, polonium, which she called after her home country of Poland, and number 88, radium. And they used to use radium to paint the hands on watches and clocks to make them glow in the dark, until they realized how dangerous that was, and it did make a lot of watch and clock makers very ill back in those days. Marie Curie was the first woman to receive a Nobel Prize, and she was the first person ever to receive a second Nobel Prize, so that's an amazing achievement. She also developed travelling X-ray machines for use in the trenches in World War I, and she became the first female professor of physics at the Sorbonne University in Paris. So she was a very accomplished person and a brilliant scientist. That's Marie Curie. Now, the next person I'm going to talk to is somebody who you may have heard of. She was a lady called Florence Nightingale. There she is. Florence Nightingale lived between 1820 and 1910. She was a British nurse, and when war broke out in a place called the Crimea in 1853, she travelled to Turkey to take care of the British soldiers there. But when Florence arrived, she found that the conditions in which these poor soldiers were being kept were filthy. There were fleas and rats everywhere, and in fact, more soldiers died from disease in that war than from wounds in battle. Florence collected information and data on deaths in the hospital, and she used this to show how good hygiene can reduce deaths. And we can see how important that is today during the pandemic that we're all living through at the moment. We all know how important it is to wash our hands and look after our hygiene, because that helps not to spread diseases like COVID-19 and other viruses and bacteria between us. So Florence Nightingale pushed for reforms at the time in terms of hygiene in war hospitals and so on, that helped to save lives. Her work and the image of her alone with a lamp nursing the wounded is legendary, and she was known as the lady with the lamp. So that's Florence Nightingale. The next person I'm going to tell you about is a woman called Rosalind Franklin. Here she is. There's Rosalind Franklin, and she worked in the field of biology. She lived between 1920 and 1958. And she wanted to be a scientist from the age of 15, which is quite unusual for a woman or a girl to get into the field of any science in those days. But she succeeded, and after going to university, she worked in a lab producing X-ray photographs of DNA. Now, DNA is a complex chemical compound, and it gives us all our genetic information. And if you see the structure of DNA, it looks like this. It's a helical structure, and it's like two helixes together, so it's called a double helix structure. And Rosalind Franklin's work was very important in helping us to discover that. One of her team's photographs that she took, one of these X-ray photographs, fell into the hands of two other researchers known as James Watson and Francis Crick. They're here. Now, Watson and Crick used the photograph to work out the structure of DNA and produce the first model of it. And as a result, they received the Nobel Prize. But Rosalind Franklin's contribution was totally forgotten. Nowadays, scientists acknowledge that without Rosalind Franklin and her team, Watson and Crick may never have discovered the structure of DNA. So that's Rosalind Franklin. So the next scientist I'm going to tell you about is a lady called Edith Clarke. Edith lived between 1883 and 1959. And she was a trailblazing American scientist. And here she is. Now, she worked in the field of maths, astronomy, and electrical engineering. And for a time, she was employed as what was known as a human computer. I'm going to tell you what that was. For a long time, highly skilled and mainly female scientists, mathematicians, and cataloguers were employed as computers by various academic companies and commercial organizations. Women took on the work because at the time they were barred from leading their own research. So that's how Edith Clarke got started. But then she struggled later in her career to get work as an engineer because she was a woman. In 1921, she invented something called the Clarke calculator, and this was a device that could simplify the complex equations used by electrical engineers faster than any previous methods. A year later, she became the first professional electrical engineer who was a woman in the United States. So she overcame a lot of obstacles. And the next person I'm going to tell you about was another American scientist called Rachel Carson, who lived between 1907 and 1964. Now, nowadays, we're very aware of how we have to try to take better care of our environment, how we have to try to cut the use of fossil fuels and start using more renewable energy sources like wind and solar power. We have to try and reduce the use of things like pesticides and start looking after our environment properly. But Rachel Carson knew about this a long time before a lot of other people. She wrote a book called The Silent Spring, in which she described the devastating effects of synthetic pesticides on wildlife and the environment. And she helped to kickstart the environmental movement that is so strong today and bring all these issues to the forefront of our thinking. So that was Rachel Carson. And the last two female scientists that I'm going to talk to you about were involved in taking forward the whole field of computers and computer programming, computers that we all use today, but which were little known about in the past. The first person I'm going to talk about is a lady called Ada Lovelace. And here's Ada. Ada Lovelace lived between 1815 and 1852. She was an English mathematician, that means somebody who works in the field of maths, who was far ahead of her time. She met the computer pioneer Charles Babbage in 1833, and then she was keen to learn more about his analytical engine, a mechanical computer he was designing, capable of being programmed and storing data much like the computers we use today. 10 years on, Babbage has still not built the machine, and actually he never would. But Ada Lovelace translated an article describing its workings, and her translation was much more detailed than the original, and she added pages and pages of notes, including a way to do complex calculations using the machine. And this has gone down in history as the first ever published computer program. Ada Lovelace. And the last person I'm going to talk about is Grace Hopper, who lived between 1906 and 1992, and she was also involved in the development of computers. She also was a mathematician, and in fact she was the first woman in the world to gain what we call a PhD in maths, and a PhD is the highest kind of degree that you can get. She believed that everyone should be able to use computers, not just computer scientists. So in 1944, Grace Hopper wrote the first ever computer manual. And in 1952, she invented one of the first compilers, which is a program used to convert a computer language into what we call binary. And this led to the creation of a programming language that would become crucial in the world, and it's called COBOL, Common Business Oriented Language. But without it, we wouldn't have traffic lights or air traffic control, and banking and healthcare systems would fail. No wonder they called Grace Hopper Amazing Grace. So that's just a quick little run through about some famous and important female scientists in the past. Happy International Women's Day. Bye.